Misinformation affects people from all walks of life in many different ways, be it at home, at school, or in the workplace. Today, we are in the beautiful city of Prague to unravel the challenges that we face, to join together to navigate to the truth and the facts. This is Fighting Misinformation Online 2022 Ideas Exchange. Hello and a very big welcome to Fighting Misinformation Online 2022 Ideas Exchange. Thank you so much for joining us, whether you are here in person in beautiful Prague or indeed virtually. It is fantastic to have you on with us. I'm Kasia Madera. Today I'm going to be discussing the complexities of misinformation in all of its varying forms, from conspiracy theories to pre-bunking. And to help us understand these very important issues, we're going to be hosting debates with experts, and we will be giving all of you the chance to raise the questions that need answering. But first, please join me in giving a very big welcome to Google's Regional Director, Czechia, Slovakia, Hungary and Romania. It's Tania Moine.
Good morning and very warm welcome to you on behalf of European University Institute, Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation, YouTube and Google. I'm Tania Moine and I work as Google's Regional Director. After a long break of in-person events, it's really fantastic to see all of you here in person, and I would like to as well give a warm welcome to those of you who are joining us from many countries all around the world online. For me today, this event holds particular significance. I still vividly remember Václav Havel's speech to US Congress in 1990, when he said to American Congresswoman and congressman the following: I often hear the question, how can United States of America help Czechoslovakia today? And his answer was as paradoxical as his whole life has been. He said, you can help us most of all if you help the Soviet Union on its irreversible but immensely complicated road to democracy. 32 years later, these words are unfortunately more accurate than ever before. Now, I clearly work for a technology company, and during the crisis, technology can achieve a lot. In fact, it can act as a lifeline. We've seen this through COVID, and we are seeing it during the war in Ukraine. Technology can help us to stay connected during the lockdowns. It can help Ukrainian users to get notified when the air raid is nearby. Or it can help refugees to understand the language of the country they had to flee to. But technology, as well as digital acceleration, doesn't come completely without challenges, as all of us here would agree. And among those challenges, misinformation proved to be the most stubborn, both in the online as well as in the offline world. And this stubbornness, in my opinion, is caused predominantly by the fact that this problem of misinformation cannot be tackled by a single party alone. And this is exactly why in October last year, we had our very first Fighting Misinformation online event, which was an opportunity to to bring together experts from the media, NGOs, academia, technology, and governments to talk about this issue and find the ways for all of us to collaborate. We've heard from some great speakers, including the School of Transnational Governance, Alexander Stab, from Vera Hoermann, European's VP Commissioner, and our very own CEO, Sundar Pichai. And this is also why, only a few days ago, we have signed the reinforced EU Code of Practice on Disinformation, very important tool that will help us to improve our joint efforts to find online falsehood across the EU. Since this event last year in October, the world has changed significantly. Today, we see the consequences of misinformation being played in brand new and far more dangerous contexts and ways. And this is exactly why it is so vital that we all come together and do all we can to help the audiences discern the fact from fiction. And that is why I'm very much looking forward to the expert panel later on this morning, who will share with us how the war in Ukraine is changing the way we think about misinformation. So I hope today's event will be an opportunity for all of us to find the new ideas, meet each other with very different perspectives, share the knowledge about what has worked and what hasn't. And our intention today is that you leave here inspired by what you have learned, with the many new contacts with whom you will be able to collaborate. So for now, thank you once again for being here with us today, and I hope you will find your day very useful and inspiring. Thank you very much. Back to you, Kasia.
Tania, thank you so much. It's really inspiring to hear those words, and I hope everybody will be inspired and learn a lot. Tania Lemoine there on the potential of technology during these times of crises. We will be building up on that. So coming up in the next 2 hours, we receive high-level commentary on the Digital News Report just in from the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. At such a critical time, we discuss how the misinformation campaign is taking shape and pre-bunking, a vital tool gathering pace in fighting the misinformation war. Now, of course, we want to hear from you on all of these issues. If you want to ask a question or actually simply just raise something that is on your mind, this is how to get involved.
Send us your questions using the Activities menu at the bottom right of the screen. Select the Q&A function, then use the plus button marked Ask a Question. Upvote by clicking the thumbs up symbol. And we'd love to see you live on air. After adding your question, if you're happy to be seen on screen, click on the hand icon in the central menu to raise your hand. And of course, make sure you've all got your cameras on. Sometimes we might poll our audience to get your reactions and views. If we launch a poll, just submit your answer by clicking on the Activity menu, selecting Polls, and make your choice. Use the back arrow to go back to the main menu.
So you know how to do it. We really want to hear your questions, all your views, very much welcome. Now, we are all prone to believing information when it's repeated, when it's easy to process, and when it aligns with our prior attitudes and our world views. Some are more likely than others to believe what they hear or they read, and those audiences continue to be the hardest to reach. Jigsaw is a unit within Google that explores threats to open societies and builds technology that inspires scalable solutions. So to tell us more about engaging with those hard-to-reach audiences, please welcome, joining us today is the research manager with Jigsaw, Beth Goldberg. Hello, welcome to you. Beth, you've been doing so much work on this, so much research on these hard-to-reach audiences. I wonder if you can just explain to us and help us to understand, how does someone typically come to believe in those conspiracy theories? Are there certain predispositions?
Thanks, Kasia, and thanks to Laura Doward and all of the hosts for having me here today. I'm excited to share a little bit of information from our research with conspiracy theorists with you all. So over the last 4 years, I've met and gotten to know over 100 conspiracy believers across the United States and the United Kingdom through a series of deep interviews. So I typically go to their houses, and I spend many hours trying to understand the full context of the person who fell down the rabbit hole, getting to know their social environment, their emotional environment, what they do for a living. And we use these ethnographic methods that are not dissimilar to investigative journalism. So we went into these conversations with conspiracy believers with an assumption that we could categorize them, and we could have, our alien hunters over here, we might have our flat earthers over here, and that they would sort of fall neatly into lines of political belief or class or education level. But everyone I met kept defying these easy categorizations. And so I learned that conspiracy believers actually come in all persuasions and all backgrounds. You've got highly educated conspiracy believers, you've got folks on the left and the right. But there were 3 clear patterns that I want to share with you all that I found throughout the 100 or so folks I met with. And these are first, isolation. Folks who felt deeply disconnected from a sense of identity or community. They didn't have an in-group that they felt particularly attached to, and they were looking for one. They were looking for a sense of belonging. Second was they felt disenfranchised. They felt completely alienated from systems of power. So they maybe had been left behind by the information economy. They didn't understand how politics really worked, so most of the folks I met with had completely stopped participating in politics at all. And lastly, they were deeply distrustful of these institutions, right? They felt these institutions weren't serving them, whether that was government or the media, or especially during COVID-19, the medical community. So they had withdrawn from these institutions. So I think these 3 drivers of conspiracy belief, the isolation, alienation, and distrust, can help us be less judgmental of these folks and really help us address the core causes of conspiracy belief.
So you were invited round to their homes, you entered into their homes, into their personal space, you got to know them. I wonder, once you kind of made that connection and you got to know them, did you find the way that there's a way of kind of pulling them out of that rabbit hole?
Kasia, I've got some bad news for you.
I knew
Of
she
the
was gonna
many
say this.
conspiracy believers I met with, there were very few who had completely extricated themselves from the rabbit hole. And this often happened when there was a major life event. Maybe they just had a child, they got a new job, they got a new partner, something that completely shook up their day-to-day patterns and often introduced them to new sources of information. But more often what happened was someone who stopped believing one conspiracy belief would simply slide into an adjacent conspiracy belief. I'll tell you about how I saw this recently with QAnon. So we met with a couple dozen believers of the QAnon conspiracy theory in the United States and Brazil. And we met these folks first in 2020, sort of at the height of their belief, and they were extremely strong supporters of former President Donald Trump. And then after he lost his re-election, we actually went back to the same set of folks and wanted to understand, after all of these false prophecies, had they lost their conviction? Had they moved on? And what we found was, yes, maybe they'd let go of that one conspiracy, but they were still looking for belonging, community, a sense of meaning. And so a lot of them had slid into the anti-vaccine movement. So I ended up becoming sort of proselytized about the dangers of vaccines in my second interview with folks, and I said, wow, okay, it's so easy to believe an adjacent conspiracy because they all share the same structure. They all actually have this simple us versus them, this way of making sense out of a complex world. And so I think my note of optimism is simply we need to focus on preventing conspiracy belief in the first place.
Preventing, we need a bit of optimism, come on, we need to hear that, and we're going to get some tools from you a little bit later. But I just wonder, Beth, as a society, are we more prone? Is there just more conspiracy theories around?
Well, I think we may be in a golden age of awareness of conspiracies and of their amplification. But I can't say definitively that we have more conspiracies or more conspiracy believers. We don't actually have good data on that going back in time. There's been one study in the US that shows that over the last 15 years, the levels of belief in certain conspiracies, say that the moon landing was a hoax, are relatively steady. And we've seen that consistent proportions of society, say 15 to 20%, believe certain conspiracy theories. But I think what we're seeing right now is a surge in discussion about conspiracy theories on social media, and we're also seeing a surge in populist rhetoric that deploys and weaponizes these conspiracies for political gain. So we may be more vulnerable to conspiracies than ever before, in part because we operate online and we're in these information silos, and sometimes we don't have the critical thinking skills or the media literacy that's really required to protect ourselves from them. And so I think I'll leave with a note that the journalists and the technologists in the audience here today are so critical for helping us to build these literacy skills and to avoid the rabbit hole ourselves.
Thank you, Beth. A lot to think about, and a little bit of optimism there, a bit of a mixed picture there, but you know, we're very grateful for the amount of and level of detail that you've gone into and the research that Beth has been doing, and all of those people that have actually welcomed you into their home to share very personal information. Fantastic stuff. Now, Beth is going to be coming back to us a little bit later in order to share that all-important tool in order to counteract conspiracy theories. We really need to hear that, so do stay with us for that, because I know you're all going to want to hear the tools of how to counteract the negativity of that. Beth, thank you so much. We will be expanding on those points a little bit further with our first fantastic panel. So join me in welcoming from the UK media literacy charity, the Student View, Bejay Mulenga, the PhD researcher from the European University Institute, Christiern Santos Rasmussen, and Valeria Kovtun. She is head of Filter. Filter is Ukraine's first media literacy program. And joining us live from Brussels, it's the project officer from Age Platform Europe, Vera Hoermann. Welcome, everybody. Lovely to have you with us. Hello to Vera as well. We are talking about, as we were hearing from Beth, those people that are really hard to engage with, hard to reach, hard to interact with. And Bejay, you're working with young people. We're always talking about how difficult it is to interact with young people, that old people like me, arguably, we just don't get it. So how, with you and the Student View, how are you interacting with them? How are you engaging with them and just making them interested in what you have to say?
So you need to meet them where they're at, first and foremost. I think a lot of times, a lot of organizations in the past have tried to educate one way to the next generation. And at Student View and with my past work for the last decade, I've always tried to create experiments and environments where people are co-creating and they feel involved. One thing about the next generation is they've seen cancel culture. They've seen people get cancelled in the news. They've seen people get uncancelled. So they're way more aware of what's going on in the internet and in the world than we sometimes believe. And then there are obviously those who are very disengaged. So it's quite hard to kind of just make a blanket statement on the whole next generation. So what we try to do, we go into environments where they're at, whether it be at school, youth clubs, or in communities that we pop up in, and we try to build newsrooms where we give them the power to work in collaboration with journalists, in collaboration with media, and understand what it takes to make a news article, what it takes to make a broadcast. And through that process that normally lasts half a day or full day, they get really up to speed with actually where sources of information come from, understanding tone of voice, understanding unconscious bias. And we found through that work that confidence goes up, that young people feel more educated and happy to contribute towards pieces of news. And then also anger goes up as well, because they're like, actually, all of these things I used to believe, they don't actually work. So our big thing has been co-creation, creating pop-up newsrooms, and it's something that we think would work for all different age groups.
That is, so it's the kind of picking up on the emotional, but also a very creative way in engaging with that particular demographic. Valeria, when it comes to creative ways, I think Filter is very much up there. Of course, before the start of the war in Ukraine, Filter had been working for roughly about a year. You're almost close to your 1-year anniversary, and we will focus on what is happening on the ground in Ukraine in our next panel. But Valeria, when it comes to creativity, we heard Bejay there getting very creative, very animated with the people that he's targeting. How do you engage? Because you've got some fantastic ideas.
One of the challenges we had was to be presented as a national project. So we cooperate and we work very closely with the ministers of Ukraine, and we are affiliated with the Minister of Culture and Information Policy of Ukraine. So there was a very high expectation from the Ukrainians that we will be dealing with all of them. And then whenever we start something, they would be like, and what about the elderly people? What about the children? Have you done something for them? Have you done something for them? So we started with building a brand, because that's the first thing to do. People want to know about Filter, and once they know it's a good thing, they will be more interested in interacting with it. So we have also like 2 centers for combating disinformation, so we need to stand out from those initiatives which were already existing in Ukraine. So what we did, we built a brand called Filter and clear messages around it. So we didn't want to position ourselves as a project that's fighting disinformation, but rather as an initiative that empowers people and explains them why media literacy can drastically improve their well-being and their quality of life. And even if I ask you here, if I ask you what are your aspirations, what are you dreaming about, you would tell me that you want to maybe buy a house or have children or take care of your children. There's nothing. You wouldn't mention media literacy at all. So what we want to do is to make media literacy something familiar, and which explain to people in the distant areas how it can help their life. And what we do for that, we do a lot of offline activities, like expo in the street in the very heart of Kiev. You would come across an exhibition which explains what media literacy is and where you can interact with it, you can read about it, you can scan some courses, and if you are interested, you can pass the test and so on. We would also make a live music concert last summer, and what was the goal for this summer as well. We made an online orchestra playing Mozart in the heart of Kiev, in the public park, and at the same time there were like a couple of people, experts on media literacy, discussing how critical thinking can change everyone's life in a very simple way. So there would be some Ukrainians walking around and hearing the music and joining the concert and listening to the discussion. We worked with the students actively, with young people, by providing them with the tools for creating their own journalistic materials. We had a competition called Reporter, where all students aged 16, 17 could submit their TV stories, podcasts, and hear feedback from journalist practitioners. And then they traveled to Kiev to intern for real TV channels, shoulder to shoulder with real journalists, seeing how it works in reality and why fact-checking matters. And there were many, many other kind of creative activities, like media literacy maze. I can talk more about that. But in the end, we see people thinking about media literacy as something positive indeed. And after the war started, we get a few thank you emails from the same students, from participants of our media literacy clubs, saying that finally I actually realized the whole importance of all this, and I could use all this knowledge in practice. And moreover, I'm following a couple of people who participated in our initiatives, and I mentioned already, I just see them commenting on Facebook under some posts, what is the source? That's a housewife who would be just not even imagining, wouldn't be thinking about media literacy a couple of years ago, is now going to the comment section and says, what is the source? Have you mentioned the source in your article or in your post? And that's kind of makes me feel happy for what we've done.
I can imagine it does. It's an incredible achievement to get somebody to think about something that potentially they weren't even aware of to begin with. As you were saying, a housewife thinking about where is that source, and thinking about Mozart in Kiev, hearing Mozart in Kiev. We will hear it again, of course, but that's brilliant. Again, just hearing that element of creativity going through and getting people to think. So Vera, when it comes to older people, I wonder the kind of challenges that you have in targeting this specific demographic. I guess, how do you get them to even think about misinformation, to understand what it is?
Thank you, Kasia. So for older people, you have the challenge at first that you have a very heterogeneous group. You have people who are very media literate, who have lots of skills already in the media and digital sector, and you have others who have never heard even of the internet per se at all. And the second part that you have is that you don't really have any structured learning opportunities that are available to younger people with schools. And there is very few media literacy programs that are targeting older people. So there has been a mapping of media literacy projects in the EU, and out of 145, there were only 7 that actually were targeting older people. And the thing with older people, again, they're a very heterogeneous group, so you would need to pick them up where they are. For some older people, that might mean that you need to start with digital skills and then add the media literacy skills to that. For some of them, they might prefer to have a peer-to-peer learning. Others might have a preference for a more intergenerational learning approach where they learn together with other age groups. And the thing is also, I think it was mentioned before as well, co-creation is a very important tool in terms of trying to identify what people are interested in, because if you do something that you're interested in, that you might also keep it long term. So it's not just about how to identifying fake news, but it's also to see how to put that in a bigger context, in a context of human rights and anti-discrimination and hate speech. And that is something that we did actually in a project called Digital. So we had an intergenerational learning approach where younger people co-created a training together then with older people on not just identifying fake news, but in a broader context on why would somebody even create fake news? What would be the intent of sharing this information? To see fake news in the role of filter bubble, to look at social media and election influence, to see how stereotypes are connected to disinformation. So what we saw in this project, which was targeting people that already were digitally literate, so this was really just on disinformation and media literacy. There was no element of like teaching somebody how to use a computer or anything like that. So this is a group of older people that really was focused on disinformation specifically, and to see how they can identify fake news, how they can report them, how they can see also to share with other people of their age group then to fight this information. So I think there are a lot of elements that were mentioned by other speakers already, to have the creativity, to have the co-creation, to have older people and younger people together, that I think was really successful in this project of trying to fight disinformation.
And again, we're hearing that aspect about creativity, aren't we? And engaging and just getting that conversation going. So Christiern, to you, when you've been focusing very much on those niche audiences, I wonder, what specifically, who specifically are you looking at? And is that creativity, that getting people to understand what they're looking at and why it's happening, what is the kind of focus that you look at when you're engaging?
So this very much goes back to what Beth was saying with the conspiracy beliefs. I think we have to reconsider a little bit our focus. These initiatives are great, but we also have to think about those people who are more vulnerable to believe misinformation or to believe disinformation. And these are people, as Beth mentioned, who have a strong identity with the cause that they feel strongly about, and the feeling of being excluded from the rest of society. And those people, for the last 2 years, we've seen how they kind of moved away from the normal platforms, Facebook particularly, to other platforms. And the pandemic also, like a lot of things happened during the pandemic. One of the things was we have an ecosystem of alternative platforms who are financing themselves. They're no longer like dependent on big corporations. It's much more like influencers can be more independent. And there, on those platforms, I don't see any of these initiatives, and I don't see fact checkers, I don't see media acting. We saw a little bit after Ukraine, because, for example, the BBC opened up on, I think, Vkontakte, but we need to be more active on Rumble, on Odyssey, on BitChute, because these are platforms which are largely left untouched. I'm looking from Russian disinformation campaign perspective, and this is very fertile ground for them, and they're active there. So these initiatives also have to consider that the internet is not just Facebook, or even Twitter. I think very much in Europe, we should not emphasize Twitter as much, because Twitter in Europe is more for, is not the common European. Facebook is a bigger thing, but especially for these niche groups, Twitter is just the place you go to make liberals angry. So I think have to kind of consider these platforms as well. So this is, we're trying to go into these areas and see if we can gather some data and see if we can change some behavior, so yeah.
But you, again, and it's that kind of raw emotion, you talk about being angry, and obviously other social media platforms are available, but Bejay, you were nodding there when Christiern was speaking. When you're working and when you're working out where the kids that you're working with, where their head is at, are they as interactive with these types of platforms? Are they aware of the kind of tools that they can use to pre-bunk, debunk, and just really understand what's going on out there?
Yeah, I think doubling down on what Beth and Christian have both said in different ways, when you're talking about generations of people, there are loads of different identities. So even with the young people we work with across the UK and abroad, we notice that, you know, these people that you're speaking about, they have children, and in their homes they speak about certain things. And these children might not bring it to school, but they might speak about it on TikTok. And depending on who you're following, your feed will kind of come up in a different way. So what we're noticing from having real conversations with young people, young adults, is a lot of them all have their different references when it comes to what's misinformation and when it comes to what's right and what's wrong. I do agree with Christian's point that we need to be more active in different platforms that people are at. So we've noticed a lot more people talking on Telegram. There's a lot more young people who actually don't even have Facebook, Instagram, or even Twitter profiles. And if they do have a TikTok profile, half of them are creating content and half of them are just observing. So a lot of conversations are happening in WhatsApp groups, iMessage groups, and you can't control what's happening in those spaces. All we can do is tell more stories and help educate people in our remit with how they can spot misinformation. And for us, one thing that we're looking at moving forward, because it's very important for us to try to capture the trend, we're looking at micro-influencers and how we can utilize them for campaigns. Because if people are not listening to their teachers, or if it's hard to reach every secondary school, every college in the country, because they get inundated with so many things, we're looking at how can we utilize people who already work in the media, people who are content creators, people that these young people are following in micro communities, and get them to be part of campaigns that tell the story of what we're trying to do. And we're finding that to be something that's working really well for us. So we're probably going to kind of double down on that in the next year.
There's an awful lot of information coming at them, and that's exactly what you're suggesting there. They're just being bombarded by all this stuff. Christian, you want to get in on that?
Yeah, because I think Bejay said a very important word, stories. A lot of these things are drawing on stories that exist out there. Stories of inequality, stories of neglect. And that's really, I think, like, we have to be more aware of what stories are out there, both so we can see, okay, what kind of misinformation could exploit this? How could disinformation actors use these narratives that exist out there to their benefit? So, for example, we saw that the Russians were active during the US presidential election, both of them, the last two, and using racial inequality as a target. So, because there were already stories out there that could be used, and there's a lot, again, if there's emotions involved, you are more prone to accept the claims, and you can be mobilized. And that, at the end of it, is what disinformation actors want. They want you to act on the information that you have been given, right?
It pulls on your emotion strings,
Yes.
doesn't it? And it's about the stories. We want to hear your stories as well, your comments as well. So do get in touch with us. We've got a comment already from Jorg Gomez. Not a question, but he wants to share his opinion, and we welcome all of your opinions. Jorge says, we need to look at this subject from the bottom up. Invest in general literacy first, then we can use that to teach media, digital and information literacy. And Valeria, that's got to be to you, surely, because that's exactly what Filter's all about.
Yeah, we focus mainly on critical thinking. So, I mean, it's not really the general literacy, but
but it's investing,
yeah,
and you have that cooperation.
It is investing in that, but I also wanted to mention that here we are talking about like how to promote media literacy online, how to debunk disinformation online, but there is a lot of effort we've done to do everything offline, especially for older people, for adults in particular, and they enjoy this atmosphere of, as Beth mentioned, having this local community, chatting about their local news, because what we are seeing in the war as well is that people are missing this understanding of what's happening in their regions and where they can get verified information about their local news, about their mayor and what's happening in political life. So when we launched this media literacy clubs, that was the goal, to bring people people together from rural areas, from villages and towns, where there would be a leader who's well-trained, who knows all the media literacy skills and how to teach them, but they would be discussing their daily life. They would have a cup of tea, speak about what has happened in their life, but at the same time use the 10 media literacy rules which we provided them with. And that was the charm in it. People were so thirsty for the offline activities, especially after pandemic. So we launched these 5 pilot clubs in Kramatorsk and a couple of other cities which are now, of course, heavily bombed or occupied. But we saw people enjoying the experience and having this positive association with the media literacy. Some of those were like 60-year-old women who wouldn't normally have anything to do with teaching or media literacy or general education, and they would come for the meeting to see other people, to communicate with them. They would travel to their local newsroom, then the next day they would go to some other town to explore the town and have these meaningful conversations, and that worked very well. Then the question is, how can we reach out to these people who are now not super media savvy, who don't have this maybe general literacy that much, who don't have the digital skills? How do we interact with them now when there is no way to do all the offline activities which we were doing? We are still trying to solve this problem. Maybe the audience will have some suggestions on how to solve it, but definitely communicating with them through TikTok or Facebook wouldn't make that much sense. You have to be there for them.
So it's that physical one-to-one interaction that's really important. And I guess, Vera, that is something that absolutely is what your audience is really craving as well. It's the physical contact, I guess, in the face-to-face, Vera.
Absolutely. I mean, when we were talking also earlier, when Beth was talking about communities, this is exactly what we see with older people as well. This face-to-face meeting up, this feeling, creating a sense of community, it is so crucial. And through the pandemic, it just wasn't possible for many reasons. So for the project that we had, the project itself, although it was set to be a face-to-face project, had to be moved online in the end. But afterwards, there was some physical meetups and events where people could share what they had learned through these online trainings. And we had, it's similar to also what Tania was saying about, we had some meetups in the park where people then were these people libraries where they could share what they had learned during the trainings. They organized quizzes, there were some exchanges. And this is just something that we had heard back then. The physical exchanges and this meeting up with people and this creating of communities was just the thing that people really got out of it. And I think that is also the thing that I tried to explain earlier. It's not just about the facts. It's not just about giving people tools, although they are important. It is important to provide people with tools on how to combat disinformation, but it is the surroundings and it is embedding it into a bigger picture, providing them with this sense of community and connection.
So again, that interaction, and I suppose, Bejay, that's really important, whether you're whichever demographic, however old, in my case, or young you are, as in your case, and especially the students you're working with. It's that a lot of peer pressure as well, or peer communication, that especially amongst the younger demographic, that is really influential on then how these guys feel and think.
Absolutely. I think the point has been raised, and it's one that we can all understand and we can all kind of see. My kind of like thinking, especially when we were chatting before the session, was when I come to panels, I'm always like, right, what can we do practically? And for me, all I can control is the people I influence every day and hope that they can influence the people around them. So I can't stress enough the importance of stories, the importance of ambassadors, the importance of having local champions in regions, because we can't just sit and rely on the internet, say, oh, we've done our bit, we've just posted. Everyone has the chance to kind of influence each other. I really believe in this proverb, it takes a village to raise a child. It also takes a village to change a human, you know? We have to look at who are we taking our influence from. And in all the work we do at the Student View, in all the work I do in my personal life, I'm always trying to think about who are the key people who will influence someone's decision. A lot of times right now, all the students that we're seeing, we know that is their peers amongst themselves, and then the micro-influencer, who's just a couple steps ahead from them, who influences them. And I think something that everyone can take away right now is start to think about, on a local level, what can you do? And practically for us, it means bringing interesting people in to tell stories and taking people away from the normal curriculum and helping them have that conversation. So it starts at Spark. But in future and for other ages, I can only agree, like when it comes to my parents and my grandparents, you need to go to places that they're at and find influencers in their spaces as well.
Micro-influencers, I love that idea. It's a really lovely idea, because you think about all the celebs, et cetera, but those micro-influencers, Christian, when you're focusing in on people that are just completely disengaged, micro-influencers and that kind of peer village around those, do they have access to that? And if they don't, how do you then get them? I wonder if you could also give us like a practical tip, something we can take away.
I think, first, one point is they have a community. That community is online. So you can try to reach them, but then they go back to that community, and then you have to fight with the norms of that community, right? So how to deal with that is important to see how can you detach people. Beth is, I advise everyone to talk to her. She's very brilliant. I think like a practical takeaway from me is start being more visible on those platforms where these communities are, and stop using Twitter, because it's in Europe it's journalists.
Other social media websites, channels are available, but no.
Yeah, of course. But the thing is, we have to consider that that you're speaking to the converted, and go where the non-converted are, and talk to them, and listen to them, and don't be condescending, but try to be inclusive. Because you have to be more attractive than the community they already have.
So it's a lot to consider, but a lot of positives as well. But it's that, yeah, the echo chambers, not to be somewhere where you're just repeating echo chambers. I've grilled you to bits, but we've got a live question coming from one of our viewers. So let's hear who you are, where you're calling from, and what is your question, sir? You are live with us here today.
On your question, your point earlier, how do you make sure that we're not seem to be patronising certain parts of the audience, people who maybe don't want to be told how to engage with media, or don't really want to hear from organisations that they maybe don't think align with their worldview? How do we avoid that sort of fear of patronisation?
Christian, absolutely.
So I was on a project where we looked at anti-vaxxers in Scandinavia. And we were trying to map this movement, and we found out that there were some concerns, which, sure, they can seem outlandish to us, but there were some legitimate concerns. The fear of losing your like freedom of movement. Now we all have to wear a passport to move around, not anymore, but a couple of months ago, right? The fear of not being able to decide what goes into your body. Those things are legitimate concerns for them, and ridiculing those concerns aren't necessarily a way to go about it. But you have to like listen to them. Okay, this concern you have, you're putting it out of proportions, and try to talk to them on talk them eye to eye. The report that we did was quite positively received in that community, and some of the feedback we got that it started to change people's minds. So having a good tone whenever you communicate with them is very important. And I think the community looking into misinformation really has to stop being very condescending when we go out over coffee about these people, because it's not really helping us to think of them as idiots. Yeah.
I guess it's that kind of, how would you behave in real life, I suppose. Yeah. Absolutely. Valeria, you've had to really change the way that Filter has been working, obviously because of the situation in Ukraine. I guess if you could help us to understand some of the aspects, how you make that change and what works for you, because the information that you're providing is critical.
Yeah, that's a huge change we've been seeing. People see fact-checking as a tool which can provide them security. So we had to come up with quick responses. So before we were always focusing on some long-term solutions, whereas when the war started, we got lots of requests from people asking, like, could you please have a training session for us, explain us which instruments we can use to verify information, which initiatives are available where we can fact-check information instantly, here and now. So what we started doing, we started providing this training. It was a 40-minute training, because when people were in the shelters, you don't really feel like having a 1 or 2 hour conversation discussing what media literacy is and why it's important. So we just collected all best initiatives where which they could use to verify information quickly. We saw a lot of them emerging. Like one of the best ones is the chatbot on Telegram, where people can just type any news message and it gets verified within a minute or within an hour, depends on the complexity of the message. And then it actually could save people's life, because when they were in the in these regions where the battles were going, it was hard to know what was happening. The situation was changing drastically. So these quick solutions were really very helpful. And just referring to this question about patronizing, we tripled our efforts on social media, of course. We are now on TikTok. So that's definitely the worst thing you can do. Find some elderly person explaining to youngsters why critical thinking is important and telling them the key tools for improving their critical thinking. So instead, we have a kind of a personality on TikTok who's also 20 years old, who can also question things and who can sometimes fall for this propaganda or harmful narratives herself, but she's always trying to find solution and see and explain to others through her own experience how media literacy skills can be helpful. And it's actually surprising to me that audience on TikTok is extremely friendly, and unlike this belief that youngsters are not super much into education and news, that's not true. They are very, very happy to listen to her long speeches on where was the fake news and how you can actually see this was fake. So they very much like this explainers. And I have never seen so many thank you messages as on TikTok. So that's one thing. Another thing, when it comes to these older people, as again you mentioned, this micro-influencers is a good thing. So that is why all the leaders of these clubs were the people who actually grew up in these areas, and they know this context and they can explain it in their language. Because all the other organizations did one mistake. They would bring a very well-trained, like a pool of trainers to these regions and say to them, okay, now you can have a 2-day workshop and teach everyone media literacy. That's not the case. This must be repetitive. It must be on a regular basis. So these media clubs would meet every week or every 2 weeks, and all the people must be like familiar with each other and with the environment where they live.
But I love that idea of somebody taking you on their journey as well, where they're trying to work out what is going on, what is true and what isn't. We've got a question from one of our viewers, Patrick Zakrzewski. Lovely to hear from you, Patrick. Patrick asks, also how to address domestic political information. Domestic political information he wants to know. Not strengthening disinformation, not strengthening divisions among our audiences at the same time. So, oh gosh, that's a complicated one. Vera, I'm going to throw that to you. So addressing disinformation, political disinformation, not alienating audiences. Vera, especially with the kind of audience that's a little bit more vulnerable, like the people that you're targeting, how do you go about that?
I think for older people, you have a bit of a different approach to media outlets than for other age groups. Overall, older people have a bit more, in general, again, older people are a heterogeneous group, but overall, you could say they have a bit more faith in institutions and a bit more faith in the mass media than other age groups per se. So I think there you can still reach older people through a more traditional means of media outreach than through Telegram or TikTok or other platforms that are less used by older people. How to try to not further have divisions. I think that was something that we did in our project very well, that we embedded the whole disinformation and combating disinformation into a broader context of human rights, into anti-discrimination, into how hate speech is used as well. And if you understand those mechanisms, it's much more difficult to pit groups against each other if you understand the mechanisms of using stereotyping, of using hate speech for the purpose of disinformation.
Okay, so again, it's just reaching out. And Bejay, a final thought from you as well, because we're hearing about this, taking people on a journey and being with them and really being interactive, the micro-influencers. We've got so much food for thought with everything that you guys have been saying. But if the one thing that really, really works for you, you talked about being in the heads of the people that you're working with. I just guess, when it doesn't work, what happens? What are the consequences? Because of course, Valeria, we know if it doesn't work when what you're doing, the consequences are critical. But with you as well, when it comes to young people, sometimes they're in a terrible place and you need to help them.
Yeah. Goes back to the analogy I said before. It takes a village to raise a child. So you're not going to get everything right. And I think the work that everyone on the panel is doing is very deep. We're doing stuff that you can't just solve in one engagement. You need to have multiple engagement with people over a period of time. And ultimately, all we can do is be change makers. You know, I say that to my team all the time. We did the best we could. We did the best we could with what we had, and that's all we can do. And over time, you're going to get champions and people that support you, and you build a unity and you build alliances. I think partnerships where people are sharing best practices are very smart. It's us against the problem. You know, it's not just we're going to be the only solution. Like in 2019, Student View was, you know, globally named one of the best media literacy organizations. I think your organization might get named one of the best in 2022 or 2023. It's about sharing best practice, you know. Only through us, you know, as a industry-wide, starting to kind of go around and go, right, I've learned this from dealing with this audience group. These are the things that I think, from a collaborative perspective, will actually enable us to pick those people that we do lose. And I think the other aspect to kind of add in is obviously everyone reacts to things in different ways. Some of us love to just, you know, be given an opportunity to share and to engage, and others pull back when it feels too much. So leaving the door open for those people who you have met, you know, 1 year ago, 2 years ago, because surprisingly, when you're in something for 10 years or 5 years, people do come back. You know, you will see people again and again, you know? So I think those are like my final thoughts.
That's lovely, repeat business. I really like that. But again, you know, congratulations on that accolade as well. It's fantastic. Questions coming in. Ronan Kennedy is asking, is there a concern that any attempts to educate, inform individuals about misinformation can be painted as nefarious by bad faith actors? For example, he's asking about attacking fact-checking as biased, Christian. Is that something that...
All the time.
There you go.
Sorry, but when so I've been collecting some data on these communities on Facebook, and whenever the small logo with "this is misinformation," that's a badge of honor in that community, and it's being seen as a positive thing, and it's like confirming this belief or the conspiracy that they have. So yeah, it happens all the time. You can also see like Russian actors does this all the time. It's calling fact checkers, you know, controlled by the Western elite and stuff. So yeah, it's a recurrent theme, and but you have to kind of figure out how to. The label's going to stick. It's going to be there. You have to, like, in your communication with these audiences, again, be more respectful, because then those barriers will come down after all.
I love that. On that, we're going to end it, because be respectful. I think that's what we're going to take away from all of this. Guys, you have been absolutely fantastic. Bejay, Christian, Valeria, Vera, thank you so much. A lot of food for thought. And I think it takes a village to bring someone into the fold, to take them on their journey. A lot to think about. Guys, thank you very much. Our fantastic panel there. Thank you. Now, everybody, we are coming to a report that is just out. It's from the Reuters Institute. It's about digital news consumption. Now, this report surveyed over 93,000 online news consumers in 46 markets. And the findings suggest that, well, the connection between journalism and the public continues to fray, with a fall in trust and a rise in news avoidance. So, to explain this latest 2022 report and its findings, please welcome Post-doctoral Research Fellow at the University of Oxford's Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, Dr. Sumitra Badrinathan.
Thank you so much for that very warm introduction, and it's really, really great to be here. My name is Sumitra, and I'm a researcher at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford. Now, the Reuters Institute does many things, but one of the things we do is that every year we release a flagship report called the Digital News Report. This is a massive undertaking in order to understand how people all across the world consume digital news online. This year's report included 46 different countries, so that's about covering half of the world's population, and we surveyed 93,000 respondents in these countries, spanning over 6 continents. We asked people about their digital media consumption, their online news habit. We also have really good data about perceptions about things like misinformation that you're all gathered here to hear about. So what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is take you through some top-line findings of the report that might be relevant for all the good work that you're doing today, and end with some insights from my own work as a researcher focusing on the Global South with respect to misinformation. So to start with, one of the things that we're seeing in this report this year is that there is a very dramatic fall in interest in news over time, and I apologize if these graphs are a bit small, but I'm sure you can see them on the screens on your tables. In a lot of countries that we surveyed, people who say that they're very or extremely interested in the news, that proportion has drastically fallen from some years ago. It's fallen particularly sharply in countries in that top section of the graph: Argentina, Brazil, Spain, UK, and the USA. Along with this, we're also seeing a sharp decline in trust in news. Across all the markets that we surveyed, about half countries have seen a very sharp decline in trust in news. And this, by the way, reverses some of the gains that were made during COVID, because during the pandemic, we saw a bunch of people turning towards the news because it was a time of uncertainty, a time of anxiety. This year, we're seeing some of these gains completely reversed. At the same time that there is a falling interest in the news, we're also seeing people who are selectively avoiding the news. We're seeing people who think that they don't want to actively follow the news for a whole host of reasons. So we see people who say that there's too much news about politics and COVID-19. We see people who say that news has negatively affected their mood. So I want to turn your attention to the quote on the right-hand side of the screen, which is from a respondent we surveyed, a 27-year-old man in the UK, who says that I actively avoid things that trigger my anxiety and things that can have a negative impact on my day. I'm going to try to avoid reading news about things like deaths and disasters, which has basically been the past 2 years of all of our lives, right? And one other data point about this slide is that we're also seeing that news avoidance is particularly high among younger people and people who are less educated, because they say that the news is very complex for them to understand. So I think one of the takeaways from this is for us as people who care about good news consumption to make news more accessible, so people who really need it in times of crises are getting that news. One last thing I want to say is that news avoidance also very, very nicely ties into people's political allegiances. One thing that we're seeing in our data this year is that people in the US, for example, who affiliate with the right wing, say that they avoid the news because they think the news is biased and they can't trust it. On the other hand, people who affiliate with the left say that they avoid the news because the news makes them a little bit overwhelmed. So we see there is news avoidance on both sides, but the reasons that people provide for doing it pretty starkly demarcated by the way they vote. So how does all of this tie into misinformation? So what I've just pointed out is kind of this nexus between a falling trust in news, a falling interest in news, and a rising active avoidance of the news. And so what this can mean for people is that it may push them away from mainstream news into their own echo chambers, into spaces where they feel more convenient. And this is where misinformation comes in, because misinformation plays into people's psyches, it gives them what they want, it feeds into their confirmation biases, and it makes them feel like they're consuming news that they feel good about, right? So in our report, we asked people whether they think they were confident about being able to tell the difference between what's true and what's not true on the internet. And across our 93,000 participants, more than half, about 54%, say that they're worried that they're not able to distinguish between what's true and false. And what's actually remarkable is that that number goes up significantly more when we look at the subset of people who say that social media is their online source, is their main source of news. That's not to say that social media causes misinformation, but it's also undoubtedly true that certain types of information are only available in online spaces, and that correlation is pretty strong in our data. As you can also see from the graph, people say that they see misinformation or misleading news about a number of different topics. And this year, COVID-19 misinformation and political misinformation is one of the things that people say they saw a lot. There's also a partisan divide in perceptions of misinformation. This graph from the United States, red bars represent people who say they voted for past President Donald Trump. Blue bars represent people who say they voted for current President Joe Biden. And you see a pretty stark divide across all topics of misinformation. Those who say they voted for Donald Trump also say they perceive misinformation of those categories to a greater extent. Does that mean they're more vulnerable to misinformation? Not necessarily. But what that could mean potentially is that their partisan affiliations are so strong to the subsets of the populations that they care about that they might dismiss things that don't fit in their worldview. And that's where misinformation comes in and might be more salient from one side as opposed to another. So you're going to hear a lot of things about ways to combat misinformation from people who are way smarter than me, so I'm not going to spend time focusing on that. What I'm going to do, though, is end with 4 implications of what misinformation could mean. We know it's a normatively bad thing. Empirically, what do we know about it? My work is focused on misinformation in the global south, but some of these takeaways, I think, apply to a lot of countries all around the world. First, we know that misinformation increases polarization and alienation. Beth Goldberg from Jigsaw earlier today talked about how people felt like they didn't have a sense of community sometimes, and misinformation maybe provides that by tying them to an in-group of some sort. So it can push people further and further away into reality and alienate them into their tiny groups. What it can also do in certain countries like South Asia and Southeast Asia, where I work, is it could be a proximate cause for violence. People who are already predisposed for conflict could see misinformation and then actually take part in that conflict, which is a very bad consequence for everybody involved. And finally, misinformation can decrease support for public health measures. Across the world, we're seeing that those who are more vulnerable to misinformation are more likely to be hesitant to vaccines and are more likely to push away public health measures that could benefit everybody. But I think personally underlying these concerns is the normative idea that a good, healthy, well-functioning democracy relies on people being able to hold their leaders accountable. And to the extent that we believe that accountability rests on correct information, misinformation erodes that. And the rise of populism all around the world, including in India, where I'm from, where for the first time in my lifetime, people are saying we may not be a democracy anymore, that to me represents a crisis that's only been accelerated by this pandemic. On that note, I'm going to end. I want to say thank you so much for listening and hand the floor back to you. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Sumitra. I mean, that's given us an awful lot to think about. And if you think about the consequences and the possibility that they could incite to violence, that really, really focuses our attention. It really does focus our energies and our minds on what Sumitra was saying. Lots of questions coming in. We have a live question coming in from inside the room. Over to you. I'll hand it over to you. Who are you and what's the question?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sumitra. That was fantastic. You mentioned about levels of trust dropping. I'm just curious whether they've dropped below the kind of COVID bump, or has actually, if you look at it over time, it's gone up, but it's gone down, but it's actually higher than it was before the COVID bump.
It's the latter. Excellent question. Thank you for that. So the COVID bump was significant enough that it hasn't gone back to pre-COVID levels, but it has decreased. And that is a worrying trend because it shows that as people have news fatigue from a pandemic that's now in its 3rd year, the trend could go further downwards.
Could I ask a quick follow-up?
Yeah.
Do you think that actually some of the things that people did to get the trust is actually increase the trust, because before it was all decreasing, if I remember the stats? So maybe we've been doing something right that we need to build on, even though there's a little bit of a deflationary increase?
That's an interesting question. So the way I'm going to answer this is I think that trust in news and our data correlates with news consumption. So the more people consume news, the more they're likely to say they trust it, right? And COVID was one of those things that people really consumed news to a much greater extent. Because we were in an environment where there was uncertainty. We were in an environment, especially in the early stages of the pandemic, where people wanted information. What is this thing? How do you get vaccinated? Is there going to be a vaccine? So to the extent that seeking out information increases trust, yes, that's what we've done. This year, after our main survey, we also surveyed a few countries around the Ukrainian war, and we found that countries that are closest to the infighting, like Germany and Poland, also saw an increase in news consumption. So it may be that crises just increase our appetite for getting information, and that does lead to a trust in news, but not necessarily one that might be stable over time.
Well, thank you so much. There's so much to digest there, but thank you very much for bringing that report hot off the press. Dr. Sumitra Badrinathan, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate your time.
Now, we've got so much more still to come, and we've heard so much already. Still to come up on the programme at this critical time for Ukraine, we will be bringing parties to the table in a bid to find the right solutions to fight misinformation. And we're going to hear once more from Valeria Kovtun, the head of Filter. We'll hear from her experience of what is happening on the ground in Ukraine itself. And with pre-bunking gaining traction, today's panel of experts share their views on how to use this critical tool to maximum effect. And remember, we do want to hear your views, we want to hear your news. So make sure you submit your questions for our brilliant panelists. All that and much, much more coming up very soon. We will be back very soon. Don't go away. Welcome back to Fighting Misinformation Online 2022 Ideas Exchange. Well, this is the event which allows all of our audience today to engage with each other through debate, through collaboration, and also an exchange of ideas. And it has been just such a fascinating morning so far. There's still more to come, though. We'll be looking at one of the most effective tools for fighting misinformation. We'll be finding out all there is to know about pre-bunking. And we want to give you a voice on all of our topics being discussed today. Our panel of experts are really ready. They're poised and eager to answer your questions and also listen to your all-important views. And this is how to do it.
Send us your questions using the Activities menu at the bottom right of the screen. Select the Q&A function, then use the plus button marked Ask a Question. Upvote by clicking the thumbs up symbol. And we'd love to see you live on air. After adding your question, if you're happy to be seen on screen, click on the hand icon in the central menu to raise your hand. And of course, make sure you've all got your cameras on. Sometimes we might poll our audience to get your reactions and views. If we launch a poll, just submit your answer by clicking on the Activity menu, selecting Polls, and make your choice. Use the back arrow to go back to the main menu.
It is hard to believe that it has been 125 days since Russia invaded Ukraine. Well, before that fateful day, the Ukrainian journalist Valeria Kovtun was hard at work developing a national media literacy project. It's called Filter. Then, of course, the war began, and Valeria's strategy had to really rapidly change course. Well, we are very privileged that she joins us now. So please, ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Valeria Kovtun back. Valeria, of course, it's really, really difficult to see what is happening in Ukraine since the 24th of February. First of all, let me just start by asking you, how is your family?
They all stay in Ukraine, in the north of Ukraine. So in Ukraine, we tend to say that we have a war-life balance these days. I was traveling to Prague today, yesterday, and I saw like people preparing for holidays, thinking about where to spend this a few weeks of their vacation. And I was thinking that probably none of my colleagues in Ukraine is going to have a vacation this summer. So we are working. It's just super difficult when you have the family who's always in the danger zone. But at the same time, it's very hard to move them. I think it might be some mentality thing, because Ukrainians are very attached to their land, to their homes. So for me to to persuade my family to leave would be just like to no avail. But we are in touch, and I'm just hoping that everything is going to be fine.
It's such a difficult time for you, it really is, and we really appreciate you coming here, talking to us, sharing your experience, and of course everything that you've done with Filter, this campaign, this incredibly creative movement that you are behind. It's nearly a year old now. I just guess after the start of the war, everything you were doing, it just changed overnight.
Yeah, definitely. On 23rd of February, we were at the Ministry of Culture and Information Policy together with other ministries, the Ministry of Digital Transformation, of Education, of some other international organizations, discussing media literacy strategy for next 5 years. We had a draft and we were arguing about every single point in that draft, and the next day the war started. So everything what we were planning suddenly stopped making sense. And then for some time we were not sure what we should do, how we should communicate that. It took us some time to kind of realize how we would be dealing with all that. Lots of team members had to flee, so it took us a week or so to kind of accommodate ourselves. And I was based at that time in the north of Ukraine. I went back to my hometown to be with my family. Very maybe not smart move, but I couldn't just leave and leave my family behind. I still hoped I would be able to persuade them to leave, but as I mentioned, it didn't work well. So I was staying there and mobilized and managed to still do the communication part. I mean, everyone in our team started doing something on their own. Someone was trying to write more posts in English to collect all their friends from abroad and explain them what was happening. And then slowly we realized that there is a huge demand in English content related to media literacy and fact-checking. So we started doing lectures and training sessions for international audiences traveling all around Europe and the UK as well, explaining the students and also some journalists how Russian propaganda works and how we've been dealing with that at the forefront of this information battlefield, information war. And then apart from that, we had to really diversify our channels. We were having Facebook and Instagram, and then we launched a LinkedIn account, a TikTok account to reach more people, because of course all the offline activities were not possible at the time. We were in touch with our club leaders from these regions. It was so sad to see them, I mean, Kramatorsk, we had a club in Kramatorsk, and in April the city was heavily bombed. So the first thing I would do, I would just call the club leader and ask, are you in safety? Where are the other participants? Zaporizhia, we had a club in Zaporizhia. It was doing very well. We had so many active people there. In Zaporizhia, this is not happening anymore. It has become a logistics hub for those fleeing from the occupied territories. Most of the people are somewhere else, some are abroad, and some of the participants were kidnapped by Russian soldiers. So we were writing reports on that, and we were kind of calling on the international attention to that. Those were why they were kidnapped, because those were the people with journalistic background who would be very much into telling the world on what was happening, about what was happening in the region. And of course they were the target. The first thing the Russian troops were doing was just to remove all communications, remove all connection with the Ukrainian communications, so that they can bring their own information environment into this area. So we were dealing with that. It was super hard. But at the same time, we are slowly getting back to kind of, I don't know if you can say normality, but for instance, tomorrow we are organizing an international expert conference on media literacy with the Ukrainian experts involved, and international from Sweden, from Finland, from the Ukrainian's presidential office. So we keep on, we keep moving, and we keep doing things, but it's definitely not easy. But
it's that balancing. I mean, just listening to what you're hearing, what you're saying, people are being kidnapped, and you're doing a creativity conference. It beggars belief how you manage to sustain all of this, the strength that you find in battling, also the kind of misinformation that's coming through. How do you balance all of that?
So these horrible things were happening in March and mainly April. So at that time, of course, we were not planning any conference, and we were only thinking about how to make sure people are provided with the best tools to actually keep their families safe and themselves safe. So as I mentioned, we started doing this express lessons, we call them, on how to verify information, how to tell which Telegram channel is sharing truthful information, which is not. We were explaining which were the techniques the Russians were using to kind of sow panic among the audiences and all these things, so that people could learn in this 40 minutes maximum of the practical things. And we had some requests from businesses as well, IT companies texting us and saying, can you please have the same training for our team. So in this draft, in this policy, which I mentioned, which we were discussing on 23rd, one of the first stages was to raise awareness about the importance of media literacy. Now I see that we can definitely skip this stage or not pay much attention to raising awareness, because most of people suddenly realize that disinformation is a weapon in a war. And if we are now all far from tanks and bombs and we are not experiencing all these horrible things happening, we are still participating in the information war. So it's actually phenomenal in a way that people started texting us and saying, how can I help? Can you please provide me with some tools? I will be doing what you say. Just tell me how can I become a participant in this information war and just help you, despite I'm not there at the forefront. So we started doing on Instagram, every day we would post like a task, what you can do, which messages you can spread, which channels you can use, and people would be like, reacting to that and spreading these messages. On Twitter, for instance, they would be calling on prime ministers of the European countries, calling on support to Ukraine. Then they would be like trying to reach out to Russians to explain to them why this is a real war, but we've seen that it didn't work, that it's not working well, because propaganda which has been working for decades, it cannot be suddenly changed. People still have this mindset. So this didn't work very well, but they were trying.
So when you talk about engaging with people in trying to change those practices, I guess has something really been effective? Because people are engaging with you, and ultimately the information that you're giving is critical, right? It saves lives.
Yeah, for instance, when we are explaining to them how Russian propaganda works and how it has been working in Ukraine, everyone is like, aha, I didn't see it before. When you dig into some background on, for instance, some cartoons which were super popular in Ukraine, and then you see that actually there is a historical revisionism inside of this cartoon where they portray Kiev Rus as a totally a Russian empire, and there is no Ukrainian origin in that. And they're like, actually, yeah. And then you tell them, look, this message on Facebook where a person is sharing a very emotional story about her daughter being raped by a Russian soldier and then saying that this is all Ukrainian government's fault. Have you ever checked their profile, and have you ever tried to figure out if this is in fact a real person? And then they do these steps and they are saying that this Facebook account has 5 friends and 1 or 2 likes, and they're like, actually, yeah, it looks very suspicious. But the first thing they would do before this training, they would just react to this comment, leave a like, and I would be thinking that indeed this is the Ukrainian government who is letting people suffer this way instead of negotiating with Russia. And these were avalanches of those bots. So we were trying to explain to Ukrainians what was happening on their social media, what they should be careful, how they can react and cannot react to certain messages, what they can and cannot share. And we are still seeing lots of problems. People are lost. They don't know where to go for where to look for the verified information. But I think it's slowly changing, and of course we need some time to kind of bring up a media literate nation.
Well, the time is critical, isn't it? But one thing that you pointed out at the beginning of our sessions today is you were speaking about, say, the housewife, the person who's at home who potentially isn't as media literate as somebody who's in an office, etc. And they were suddenly talking about, what's the source? And I just thought that was inspirational. That is something tangible that we can understand. You've changed someone's life and the way their perspective is, the way they're thinking about what they're reading.
Yeah, their first impulses, definitely, they changed. And there's sometimes, they go to quite reputable media outlets and they still, it's not like they believe blindly, they still question things, and that's the main goal we wanted to achieve, that people wouldn't take things from the first source and trust it blindly. So And then apart from that, this community of students who participated in the competition reporter, who are 17, 16 years old, they were working very well during the wartime. Many of them sent us their interviews or stories about their local heroes. And these were, it was so nice to see this new generation and understand that we actually contributed to their development as young journalists. And then when the critical moment came, and we made this shout out telling like, hi reporters, hope we are safe, if not just let us know, but we would like you to join this battle on the information front. Could you please help us improve the spirit and maybe just look for some really bright personalities in your region and tell us their stories. Maybe someone is a doctor, maybe someone is fighting at the front. And there were like up to 20 brilliant stories about ordinary people who had to abandon their business, their companies and fight at the front. There were stories about doctors who would work 24/7, and these were all done by 16, 17-year-old young reporters who had gone through our training, who had submitted their TV stories before and got a feedback from journalist practitioners. So we see the impact, and we were very lucky to have this network of people who could actually jump into these extreme activities when the war started.
It's been absolutely fascinating to hear your lived experience when it comes to the situation in Ukraine. It's really, really powerful to hear the kind of tangible, the practical things that you are doing to help people, to save lives ultimately. Valeria, thank you so much. Valeria Kovtun, everybody, I think we just have to say we applaud what you do. Thank you. Now, we will be with Valeria. She'll be joining us a little bit later. So, think about your questions, because it's really, really emotive what Valeria was sharing. So I do want you to just have a think and just put some questions to her. She'll be joining us for the Q&A session in just a moment. But we're also going to get some personal perspectives on all of these subjects that we've been discussing with Valeria. So with our panel, do join me in welcoming onto the stage Jakub Gornicki, the co-founder of Outriders. We're also joined by Ladka Mortkowitz, a fact-checking journalist at AFP. And joining us from London, we've got Sasha Havlicek, and the founding CEO of the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, and Tom Kent, also joining us. He's from the Jamestown Foundation. He is in Riga in Latvia. So everybody, welcome very much. Brilliant to have you here. Hello. Hello to our remote panel as well. Lovely to have you all here. It's just been really, really crucial to hear, I think you'll all agree, what Valeria was saying, that experience. And Jakub, I know we're going to be talking to you because you've been in Ukraine as well, doing some tremendous work. But I just want to start with you, Sasha, if it's okay. When we hear about the level of misinformation that has come from Russia since the start of the war in Ukraine, I just wonder, what's your initial reaction? Are you surprised by just how much there is of it?
No, no, we're not. It's, we see this, of course, information has always been a central pillar of the Kremlin's military strategy, their foreign policy strategy, and their ground game is always accompanied by cyber information. And in that sense, Ukraine is no different to previous Russian aggressions. What's interesting, what's different now is that there's finally a recognition of the fact that the likes of RT and Sputnik, Russian state media, is in fact a pillar of Russia's foreign policy and military apparatus, and it's been banned. But what we also see from our research is that addressing that layer of overt Kremlin propaganda alone doesn't stop the flow of disinformation, because we need to remember that their information operations take the form of covert, but also semi-covert and fully covert influence operations. So while we're dealing with some of that top layer, if you like, of overt propaganda, research that we've done shows that, if you like, the other tiers in a pyramid, in a way, producing more content even at that sharp tier, are really very influential in propagating disinformation. We need to do more. So yes, we're not surprised. In fact, many of those networks of content producers who are not explicitly affiliated with the Kremlin, but are often incentivized in some way to spread the same messages. We see them, and in fact that wider cacophony of pro-Kremlin voices, turn from producing, for instance, COVID, vaccine-related disinformation, pro-Kremlin narratives around that. They sort of pivoted to Ukraine now when the war broke out, and we've seen them do, reach enormous audiences.
It's interesting how you say that the target area has moved, it's pivoted. Tom, you've written extensively about Russian disinformation. What do you make of what we have been seeing so far? Sasha was saying she's not surprised. I know you've got strong views, especially how Russia arguably did at the start of all of this.
Right. Well, what surprised me was how badly the Russians started out on the information front and how well the West did. In the very beginning, the West was very good in its pre-bunking, which is to say, saying, yes, absolutely, the Russians are going to invade, despite everything they say about not invading Ukraine. So from the very beginning, the West established its credibility by actually giving people the truth about what would happen. And then in terms of the Russian propaganda machine, I don't think they got the memo that the Russians really were going to invade. They seemed caught by surprise and pretty flat-footed. And for the initial week or two or three of the conflict, the Russian image was really awful in the world. The enduring pictures that lodged in people's minds were Putin sitting at that ridiculous long table presiding over the war, and Ukrainian farmers dragging Russian tanks around with tractors. But after that, the Russian machine did recover, and things are more even now in the information war. I think the Russians have found their legs finally.
So a little bit more even now, but it's interesting to say that how you felt that they started off badly, Tom. Ladka, you're there, you have to unpick all of this. You have to work through what is true, what isn't. I guess from your experience, it must be terribly complicated in terms of how to do that. And I wonder just also regionally, is there something specific to this part of the world?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I want to say that I have a great fortune working for AFP and having all these great colleagues in almost all the countries concerned. And so it's a common effort, and we manage to sift through a lot. But of course, there are things that simply cannot be checked. I mean, as a fact checker, you have to provide proofs. Otherwise, it's impossible. So a lot of the propaganda, when it's too nebulous, the claims are just anonymous, or it cannot be sort of pinpointed. Then there is nothing we can really do. What I would say is specific to this region, or there's more of it than, let's say, in Western Europe right now, is the propaganda aimed at fake news aimed at refugees, simply because there are quite a few of them here. In our countries, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, etc. And so what we're seeing are some of the techniques that are employed are sort of the same as during the refugee crisis of 2015-2016, but some of them are not. I mean, the previous refugee crisis, the claims were quite obviously racist. Whereas right now, I would say that the propaganda is really trying to whip up economic fears in the societies. And so because there is quite a bit of sympathy with the Ukrainian refugees, I would say it's harder for the disinformers to sort of create really negative feelings about them. So what they do instead is sort of obliquely blame the refugees or rather create sort of fear in the society that the refugees are taking away much needed resources from the local populations at the time of runaway inflation and spiking energy prices, etc.
Well, I guess when you see the largest displacement of people in Europe since the Second World War, you see that, don't you?
Up till now, I would say that the societies have coped really well, and the disinformation, as I said, it's been hard, I think, for the propaganda to really whip up negative feelings. But you know, as the war will drag on, people get tired. The economic crisis is not going away. On the contrary, so we expect this to get harder and harder.
Well, on that note, Ladka, it's fascinating to hear your insight and actually those tangible methods that you use. Jakub, Outriders, it's a digital publisher, you're the founder, you're a journalist, you've been in and out of Ukraine an awful lot since the war started. You use innovative storytelling techniques. How do you try and counteract the misinformation that is potentially coming through?
So first of all, you know, we are just a group of on-the-ground reporters, and there are two different layers to, you know, counting misinformation. In our case, when we are on the ground, we have a very good knowledge about what is happening a few kilometers around us. And we have a very nuanced knowledge regarding this. Then there is the second layer, and when you follow all the events from Ukraine, you know, via social media, you actually know more than people on the ground, because you have like a more broad perspective. You know, we would have sometimes people call me, say, listen, there is a missile hit like 20 kilometers, you know, from you. You just learn those things at a later stage. But what is crucial when it comes to on-the-ground reporting, it allows you to in-person verify certain informations, you know. And you see that, you know, just let's take as an example what happened, you know, over the weekend. We've had, again, attacks on Kiev. And then you have those different narratives which are then spiked, which is like, no one was inside. It wasn't actually a Russian missile. It was before that it was shot down by Ukrainian air defense, so it's their fault. And you have those couple narratives, you know, which are then, it doesn't really matter for the misinformation what sticks. It's basically to spread the doubt, you know, that none of the versions is actually true. And sometimes when you hear all those different narratives, they just sound stupid, but it's the purpose of it is to have them as many as possible, and so people would be like, maybe it didn't happen. I mean, look again, like I think when the battle cruise Moscow was shot down, the first days was like, maybe no one was on board, maybe it actually didn't sink, maybe it sank, it was a drill, and so on. So, you know, they were trying to spread as many different informations. Of course, it was hard to go in person there. But I'm just always going to say, you know, on-the-ground people allow you to verify. They create a lot of sources. And I just want to say one thing because we'll be talking later on pre-bunking. What really helped, or what the pre-bunking of the coming Russian invasion allowed to do, is, first of all, for Ukrainian media to prepare. And a lot of them had different plans. What will they do in case of war when it comes to how to secure their operations? And second of all, thanks to this, a lot of journalists from different countries came. So when the invasion began, there was hundreds, if not over 1,000, non-Ukrainian journalists in the country ready to report. It wasn't like, oh shit, it started, and now we have to travel, you know, fly across the world, and you know, get organized, you know, for some media find fixer, for some not. That would be days lost just on the logistics. Whereas everyone, although shocked to the scale of the invasion, was ready to report immediately. And I think this pre-bunking, in a way, was a key thing why later on this invasion is covered in such extent, because there's many people who are doing this and doing different things.
But it's quite specific because there was concern in the build-up, and although it was still a shock at the scale of the invasion, there was an understanding that something was going to happen. So that was quite a different set of circumstances. Sasha, in terms of when you don't have the ability to preempt something like this, what can you do? I know that the Institute for Strategic Dialogue has been really focusing in on this kind of tangible methods of counteracting this. Give us some advice, Sasha.
Well, I think there's a number of things that we need to do in the moment. We do need to work to decrease the availability and reach of disinformation better. And this is important even we start to try and mobilize the kind of the counter speech that we do, that others do, the kind of educational work that you've heard about that's long term to be resilient to this kind of disinformation. I was saying, you know, you have these enormous networks of pro-Kremlin influencers now reaching millions and millions of people. And we've got to do a better job of understanding how they distribute their content, but also how they game the algorithmic systems of the platforms. I'll just give you one example. We did a recent investigation that looked at information across Facebook about the Bucha atrocities, and it showed that content that denied or cast doubt about the Bucha massacre had significantly higher engagement rates across 20 countries on Facebook. And in fact, that kind of content was being shared 40 times fact. And that in itself can promote the content and game, if you like, the algorithmic system. So I would say we've got to do a better job of controlling that flow in crisis times. We've got to be setting up sort of information crisis mechanisms to respond when we know that there's this kind of reaction in a case like this. But yes, we talked about pre-bunking. Absolutely. We've got to do better communications in general, targeted to specific audiences, with more compelling and genuine and emotive content. We do know that just myth busting, just sharing sort of fact-checked content isn't enough. You've got to reach people emotively. And I would like to say one thing that...
Yeah. Go on, Sasha. We're just losing you a little bit, but I'm going to go on.
Sorry. Just want to say many organizations are trying to do this work, both in terms of identifying and sometimes trying to attribute the kind of disinformation that we're seeing pushed by Kremlin and pro-Kremlin sources, and then respond to it. But they are often at risk of legal prosecution because of potential of libel, at risk in terms of attacks and harassment and even physical safety. And I would say there is a lot more that needs to be done by governments, by companies, to protect the sector, protect the organizations that are often small and working tirelessly on the ground to do this kind of work.
That's a really good point, that focus, that the help and the support that these smaller organizations need. It's a really, really interesting, another tool that you can use. We have now, I believe, a live question from the audience, so I'm going to throw it over to table 5, please. If you could just give us your question, who are you? And if you've got a specific person that you're aiming this to, it would be really good to know as well.
My name is Frank Vrabel, and I'm the founder and CEO of Semantic Visions. It's a Prague-based company, and we are a digital intelligence firm. We assist, or we are in the front line of information war with Russia, and we assist or support multiple governments, to include the United States or the UK governments. So the topic of this today's event is misinformation, and today we heard another terms like disinformation or information war. So I think that we should address or define the problem properly, and there's a significant difference between misinformation and disinformation. And when we're talking about what Russians are doing in Ukraine, and in other parts of the world, this is certainly not misinformation, but definitely disinformation. If I take a look to the definition, Wikipedia, misinformation is incorrect or misleading information. It's different from disinformation, which is deliberately deceptive. So Russians, and there's another term which hasn't been mentioned today, and this is information operations or psychological operations, which the Russian government is conducting at least, or has been conducting at least since 2014, or even before that. And this is a systematic long-term operation to influence or to manipulate people's minds and their attitudes, and to dismantle our democracies. So I would love to broaden our conversation on the topic because this is in the core of the problem. This problem, unfortunately, cannot be solved with fact-checking because there's too much information in the world and disinformation, and there's not enough of fact-checkers. And once the disinformation appears in the cyberspace, it already impacts and harms the society. So the only response, in my opinion, is a technological response that we would be able to detect disinformation in real time. And I am pleased or I'm honored to share with you that our organization, Semantic Visions, has been acclaimed by the US and British government in 2019 to detect disinformation online. So the technological solution is here, and it would be great to be applied broadly.
Well, do you know what, František? Fantastic question there. And Tom, I'm going to bring you in straight away because, yes, we're talking about misinformation. Your book is talking about disinformation. Just help us to understand, Tom.
Well, fact-checking, as the Semantic Vision colleague pointed out, fact-checking and media literacy presuppose that people care about facts. And for some audiences, what's true is almost irrelevant. What they're looking for is strong argumentation that connects to them on an emotional level. So for that reason, my belief is that we should be doing more in terms of our own information offensive, actively campaigning for our values in a way that is memorable and engaging, and we make our own emotional arguments. I don't think there's anything wrong with emotion. If we don't feel an emotional attachment to freedom, we can hardly expect others to.
Tom, thank you so much. We've got another live question, this one from the room. If we could get your, we're going to cross over to table 2. If we could get your question, and if you've got a specific person you want to aim it to, please do let me know.
Yeah, I'm Bill Adair. I'm the founder of PolitiFact, and I want to follow up on some of the comments about fact-checking. When I started as a fact-checker, I had this vision that seemed appropriate back then, that we would just publish our fact checks and that the world would be enlightened. That didn't work out so well. So I'm interested to you about what now should the role of the fact checkers be? Can we just provide the corrective information, or do we need to be more active and work more aggressively to confront the people who are pushing the misinformation, to seek to have it removed from wherever it is? What is the role? I've definitely evolved on this. I no longer believe we can just publish.
Ladka, do you want to take that away as the person who's doing the job?
I think I see fact checkers as just a very small part of a bigger army. And I think that's why we're all here, because we're actually talking about pre-bunking, which means kind of psychologically preparing the world audience for an sudden onslaught of disinformation or misinformation. And so, as I said before, I think that fact-checking, we really do have quite severe limits in what we can do and what we can't do. And that's, you know, by definition, if you can't check something, you cannot publish. Because, you know, we are journalists. And I would say that the standards that we are held up to are even much higher for fact checkers than they are for the so-called traditional journalists, because we really have to provide very solid evidence to be able to say, no, this is not true, this never happened, or it happened differently, or this is taken out of context. Whereas traditional journalists can just say, well, let's talk to the other side and see what their opinion is. And so I completely agree with you that it is not a panacea. It's fact-checking alone cannot solve the problem and cannot save us. And I think that we should be talking more about, we should all be, we should work together more. We should work together. We should work together with pre-bunkers. We should definitely employ technology as much as we can, AI, etc., because fact-checking itself is limited.
And I guess also, you know, that using something creative. And Valeria, I want you to come and join us as well now. So come over and come and sit with us. But while you're coming over, Jakub, so with Outriders, you're very much about the innovative, of course, journalism as well. But how much do you have to balance the storytelling with the facts? And you were touching upon the kind of bigger picture facts that you get from being outside of the area, and then getting it checked with your journalist actually on the ground. How does that all work?
Well, basically, you know, we've seen the report today, you know, done by Reuters Institute, and basically no one wants news, you know, and it's falling. And why are you surprised in a way, you know? I mean, it's just negative, and you know, solution journalism is trying to counteract in it. But, you know, if you ask people, do you want a good story? They usually say yes. So, you know, we have different players who take the field of journalism. If you look at the streaming platforms, they release great documentaries. But, you know, HBO Max will never say we are a journalistic platform, whereas they actually fulfill this role. So going back to us, we try to, our audience knows that we probably will be the last to report on something, but it's going to be checked, and the story they will get is going to be good. I mean, for us, story always comes first, and whatever techniques or things we do, it's just to make the story stronger. So, you know, I'm currently working on a huge story about the Russian occupation, which is a story coming from actually 44 different villages, which I have visited in person. And you have tragic stories, you have positive stories, you have absolutely brutal stories, but you also have, you know, and now it's the second month I'm into this, and it's probably going to be one more month before it's going to be released. But just, you know, just to give people like, not just individual story, because usually, you know, you have first-person accounts and so on. So when we collected the materials, we said, okay, this is going to take ages. But at the end, it's going to give you a picture of how does the occupation look like? What factors do you take into consideration, and so on and so on. So this is our role. But just so you know, we are a small media outlet, you know. So our recipe is to be on the ground, and people trust people who are on the ground. It's like you cannot combat the idea, you know, I'm in Kiev, not maybe in this old school TV way, sorry, but you know, look how many people who vlog. Look on Twitter how many people rose right now because they are there, and they just say like, okay, this is how it looks like. This is my piece of Kiev, this is how it looks like, and this is what they show you, you know? They don't give you the whole geopolitics around it and so on. This is actually really powerful.
It's really powerful to hear what you say, and the fact that it's story-led, but also the amount of work that goes into that. It's journalism, but it just does take such a long time and energy and resources as well. We've got a live question coming in from table 16. So please, if you'd like to let us know, especially if you've got someone specific you'd like to ask.
Yeah. Thank you. My name is Mark Little. I'm the co-founder of a company called Kinsen, and we're using technology to try preempt misinformation, disinformation, but particularly outside of the English language and the countries directly affected by the conflict. And one thing we've noticed, and I think the question is probably to Ladka or to Sasha, is, you know, we see a lot of misinformation talking points from Russia resonating in societies where there's existing toxic political debates or populism or anti-Western sentiment. So I'm really curious as to where you've seen Russian talking points gaining ground during the conflict. And what does it tell us then about the sort of global combating of misinformation, particularly when all the attention is, you know, a lot of on English, and it's not really in places like India in Hindi or Brazil in Portuguese? What are the lessons to be learned globally from this invasion?
Sasha, let's take that to you, because you're looking at that larger perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I mean, this war has highlighted global differences in moderation practices on social media, but also in response writ large, both to Kremlin information operations, propaganda, and to the war itself. And we see much greater traction of Kremlin state media narratives, for instance, beyond Europe and the United States, where there is a really concerted effort, and we need to be very live to this effort by the Kremlin, and increasingly actually Russian Chinese authorities sort of amplifying those Kremlin narratives to paint the war according to that Kremlin narrative. And, you know, they're very, very good at tailoring their messages to different parts of the world and to different perspectives in those parts of the world. And we know this. It is a sign of what is at stake here, because it is clear that the trajectory of this war will ultimately determine essentially the balance of power between authoritarianism and liberal democracy on the global stage. So the role of disinformation here is of existential importance, and we are much too narrow in our focus on Western markets. I think in all cases of disinformation, but there's a lot of scrutiny in English language, but also in Western markets in general, and very, very little by comparison being done internationally, where effectively there is a play for the center of gravity that will have a massive impact on the geopolitics of the future. So, you know, our role in countering this is absolutely existential as well. And I do think we do have the technology, and, you know, our organization, other organizations have talked about this. We can track in real time. Remember, it's not just about content, it's about the kinds of behaviors, inauthentic behaviors, you know, botnets and fake accounts to amplify the kind of reach of this type of content. Those types of behaviors are not allowed by the platforms, but we see too much of it happening anyway. Those are the sorts of things we can catch and we should be removing fast. And then we have to be able to package fact-checked content using credible voices and influencers that have trust within specific contexts to get that information into those environments in a way that will stick. And it isn't just about putting it out as is. So there is more that we can do there. And there's more in this sort of offense space that we can be doing.
And I guess when Sasha talks about critical, nobody knows better than you, Valeria, about the critical consequences. I just think, in a sentence, something that we can take away, what would be helpful? What should all of these organizations, the people in this room, the people watching, what would help?
There is a narrative which is being promoted these days, like fatigue from the war, people being tired, and you know, some communication specialists in Ukraine are saying this is another narrative which Russia tries to promote to persuade the world that this war is kind of like draining them too much. And but at the same time, every single day, I'm thinking about it like every single day, people are risking their lives. And we here just having these intellectual discussions about disinformation, but there are things which are much more important, like people's life. So what the world can do is just to not stop talking about it. And then secondly, thinking twice before providing platform to propagandists. Because I think there is a very thin line between balance and providing a platform for propaganda. There is this, the famous BBC guidelines are saying that you should try to portray both sides. But did we provide a platform for Hitler during the Second World War? And then I went live for a couple of TV channels during this like most active phase of the war. And then after me, there is Lavrov speaking for 20 minutes, like really voicing his opinion on what's happening. Then the question is this indeed a balance, or is it a platform for propaganda? One of the most famous British TV channels is doing it. And not only that, channels all around the world are doing that. So, and then another thing, when you invite a Russian politicized person who's very much into the politics and knows which narratives to promote, how do you frame this conversation? How do you make sure this interview is indeed a discussion rather than this person talking nonstop and saying, there was a case when the Russian politician was saying, well, these are verified sources. How do you know these are verified sources? How do you know that AFP is a verified source? And then how do you want me to believe that what you're saying is truth? And then whatever you say to them wouldn't make sense. They would say, oh, well, I know a family from Donbass who moved to Russia and who's very happy to be in Russia. Do you know such a family? This is my personal connection.
It's just adding that doubt.
Yeah.
It's just that adding that question, the doubt that then starts turning around the narrative. There's so much to discuss. We've got a live question from table 11. If you would just like to offer up your question and who it is for, if there's someone specific.
Hi, thank you very much. I am Kinga Sorban from Hungary, and I work for the Institute of the Information Society at the University of Public Service. And among many, many other topics, we also research trust and awareness in the information society. And as regards the war that's going on in Ukraine, we have observed that there is a very huge attention on social media, especially on TikTok. So several people are posting these short videos to TikTok. Some of them are citizen journalists who wish to inform the public, wish to inform everyone about what is really going on. But what is more alarming, that some of these people are, for example, pure attention seekers who post content for support from others. Sometimes they post footage from old wars or even footage from video games. Some other people, for example, use the platforms to try to confuse the enemy about military operations that going on. But in the meantime, we do not really have clear guidelines for social media content creators on how to address the issue in Ukraine. So what would be your key message to social media content creators or citizen journalism on covering the war and posting ethically about the war?
So it's a big topic there, but I guess, you know, Ladka, ultimately you've got a code by which you adhere to as for AFP in terms of what it is that you do then, then publish.
Yes, of course, but we check the information that is already on social media. As for the creators, I mean, anyone is free to post what they want on social media as long as it doesn't violate the basic guidelines. And I mean, you may agree or disagree with it, but unless it's really harmful content, I guess it stays there. And the role of the fact checkers is just to check whether it's true or not. Provided that there is some kind of a presumably harmful intent.
Hugely complicated. We need another extra hour, don't we, guys? But unfortunately, we are, as always, out of time for such a big topic. But Jakub, Ladka, Valeria, Sasha, Tom, thank you so much for your contribution and for just getting us to really think about exactly what is happening in the context of Ukraine. Thank you so much, guys. Huge thanks to our A huge thank you for all of our questions, and thank you for all of our questions from all of you who are watching. Don't forget, submit them, submit your questions. You can use the Q&A function, which is on Google Meet. If you want to ask a question live, well, you've seen it here, some fantastic questions coming in here in Prague. You can also, when you're viewing remotely, just raise your hand via the function on your device, and after submitting your question, so that we can ask those that are the most popular. So please do. There's so much to think about. I'm sure you've got lots of questions. Do keep them coming. Now to pre-bunking. We've heard so much about it already, but we're going to get a real insight now. Pre-bunking is a technique that has been widely researched and trialed in many different settings. But what exactly is pre-bunking? And is it something that, well, we should be using more in the fight against misinformation? Well, returning to give her definition of pre-bunking, please welcome back Beth Goldberg.
Thank you so much, Kasia, and it's lovely to be back with you all. You've heard this term pre-bunking now floating around all morning. I'm finally here to give you a definition and maybe an example as well before I'm followed by a fantastic panel of experts to give you some of the applications of pre-bunking that they've been testing. We'll also get to talk a little bit about how creators may be the ones who are best placed to be using pre-bunking. All right, so what is it? At its most simplest, pre-bunking is a communication technique that is designed to preempt misinformation by building your mental defenses against that propaganda that's trying to manipulate you. It really relies on this fundamental premise that no one likes to be manipulated. It taps into this really intrinsic human need to have autonomy and to avoid manipulation. it actually works just like a vaccine, which we're now all experts on. Thank you, COVID-19. So similar to the way that medical inoculation gives you a small microdose of the virus itself so that you can then build antibodies to it, think of inoculation or pre-bunking as a mental vaccine or a mental inoculation. When it was first created in the 1960s, there was a fellow named William McGuire. This is the height of the Cold War, and he was tasked with helping folks gain mental resilience to communist propaganda. And so he said, well, why don't we come up with a vaccine for brainwash? And this is actually his graphic here on the right side of the screen, which I love so much. And so today you're going to be hearing this term pre-bunking, which is really an umbrella concept for psychological inoculation. Now let's get into how it works. So since the 1960s, it's been applied across a whole variety of fields. It was obviously originally designed for propaganda and misinformation, but you all have likely been exposed to pre-bunking messages in public health campaigns. So for example, campaigns not to smoke very frequently apply pre-bunking tactics. Some of these other papers more recently come from some of the experts you'll hear from today on the panel, look at how to pre-bunk things like radicalization into violent extremist movements, or how to pre-bunk climate denial. So pre-bunking works similarly, it's a cousin of debunking, which I'm sure you all are familiar with, which is over on the right-hand side of this timeline. So after someone is exposed to misinformation, you can show them fact checks, you can show them post-exposure notifications, but this deals with specific claims, specific pieces of misinformation. Pre-bunking or inoculation comes before the misinformation, and it's actually much more akin to an information literacy or media literacy curriculum, right? It's not dealing with a specific misinformation claim. It's actually dealing with a misinformation narrative or a misinformation technique that you can predict and anticipate. So we've talked about what it is at a high level. The actual sausage is made with just this three-step approach. It's actually a surprisingly simple concept, and we're actually going to have a workshop this afternoon where we'll each craft our own pre-bunking messages. The very first step is just an emotional warning. You're trying to alert someone, help raise their mental immune system, if you will, to the fact that in the future, they're going to encounter propaganda or misinformation. Second, you help equip them with the counter arguments they need to refute that propaganda. So for example, if you know someone's going to be exposed to, say, scapegoating refugees, you might start with a definition of scapegoating and say, this is what's wrong with scapegoating refugees. If you blame a minority for an entire society's problems, this is why that falls short. And then lastly, you really bring that home with an example or a microdose. Think of this as a small piece of the propaganda. So I might show a meme of refugees being scapegoated or a short video clip, and then end with a call to action and a reminder for people to be aware and make sure that they're not manipulated online. We're going to show you a quick example of a video that we've developed for pre-bunking online, but I want to leave you with the three advantages that I see to pre-bunking compared with other methods of countering misinformation. So earlier today, Kristen talked about how fact-checking can often be perceived as patronizing, or other forms to counter misinformation might be misperceived as patronizing the audience. But the tone with pre-bunking is actually empowering. It's designed to say, this is for you to equip yourself. You need to defend yourself. And so it's not telling you what is true or false. Second, it's designed to be apolitical. It's sort of above the fray of the specific contentious debates of a particular claim. It's focused more on the motive, on the how, rather than the what. And lastly, it's non-accusatory. It actually presumes the audience is the innocent one. The audience is the one who is being taken advantage of. And so it has this very non-judgmental tone to it that appeals to a wide audience. In just a second, we're going to show you a video that was produced by my team at Jigsaw, along with psychologists at the universities of Bristol and Cambridge, including John Roozenbeek, who will join us on the stage here in a moment. And we'll be looking at a video on the concept of false dichotomies, which is a very common misinformation technique. Let's take a look.
Either you stop watching the lamestream media, or you want all puppies to die. Makes sense, right? No? Good, because it shouldn't. It's a common manipulation technique called a false dichotomy, or a false dilemma. It's designed to make you think you only got two choices to choose from, when in reality, there are more. As with our little dilemma at the beginning, there's no reason why you can't watch mainstream media and want all puppies to live. The two don't rule each other out. And by presenting you with an option that is clearly undesirable, and the option the manipulator wants you to pick, your choices are narrowed down for you. A famous example of a false dilemma is this one from Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith.
My allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy! If you're not with me, then you're my enemy.
Anakin's claim that Obi-Wan is either with him or is his enemy is a clear case of false dichotomy. Obi-Wan is trying to prevent Anakin from joining the dark side, which naturally involves being critical of Anakin's choices. But just because Obi-Wan disagrees with Anakin doesn't automatically make them enemies. Obi-Wan's reply is actually perfect.
Only a Sith deals in absolutes.
Good old Obi! Be on the lookout for instances of false dichotomies in real life. They're more common than you think. Truth Labs. When things are too black and white, dare to be gray.
Wow, Beth, well, fantastic video. There's a lot to pick up on there. We're going to talk through all of these fascinating points made by you in your presentation on pre-bunking. We're going to expand it. We're joined by John Cook, Post-doctoral Research Fellow at Monash University. Calouste Hernandez, hello, Head of Public Policy, I'll get that right, Maldita.es. And together we've got John Roozenbeek, Postdoctoral Fellow at the University of Cambridge, which already, Beth, you already gave us a bit of a preempt that he's going to come, so welcome to all of you. There's so much to discuss. John, let's start with this idea that it's getting traction. Pre-bunking is getting traction. Is it effective?
There's been decades, like over half a century of research into inoculation and found that it works across a whole range of topics.
So just before we go, inoculation, pre-bunking,
sorry,
just remind us.
The scientist already lapsing into the jargon, I apologise. So, I mean, pre-bunking and inoculation is used interchangeably, and that's typically how we do it. And yeah, pre-bunking has been shown to be effective, whether it's science topics or political topics or even emotional topics. It's a really powerful way of communicating.
It's powerful. And Calouste, also, what about humour? How does that work into it?
How about
humour?
Humor. Oh, yeah. I think it's there is always this, and this concern has been raised here today, about appearing patronizing or not connecting very well. I think humor has a real way to play into this. I mean, I'm a journalist by trade, and I know that as long as the information is quality information, as long as there is a journalistic approach to that, and you are providing people with the kind of tools they need, humor and format are tools that are basic to our work, and you can see that in fact-checking organizations around the world. Like those people that are asking themselves, like I do, like where do I find the people that is having problems with disinformation and misinformation? And the answer is always everywhere. And you have to find them and connect with them in many different places and through many different formats. Humor is a wonderful one to do that. You need to be, I guess, cautious not to go from humor to satirizing people, make them feel bad, but I think it's important.
It's and what Beth was saying as well, it's that kind of borderline patronizing, you avoid it, what Christian was saying earlier. But John, you're engaging with this kind of audience through a completely different way. Talk us through the games that you've been doing.
Yeah, so John also made a couple of games, so really not the only ones, but we, a couple of years ago, we decided to make a game that basically puts you in the shoes of the fake news creator. And so the idea behind that was, it's a bit more fun, it's a bit more against the grain, I guess.
Is it allowed to be fun? Are we?
Right, yeah, especially because, of course, you want people to play the game sort of out of their own motivation, right? Just to sit down and think, hi, this is fun, rather than, I'm going to sit down and learn something, right? Which is, of course, also useful, but there's a market for both, I would say. So the bad news game that we made is basically the idea behind it is you learn how to produce fake news in a safe environment. You're not actually creating fake news, of course. But you are learning how the strategies and tactics that are often used in the production of misinformation, how they work by playing the game.
By playing the game, and also, I guess it's Beth, you've been touching upon this throughout, and I know in the workshops that you'll be doing, pulling emotional strings.
Absolutely, yeah. So we know that misinformation pulls on your emotional strings, and we'll see a video later today on how to preempt some of that emotional string pulling. But I do think that our messages, when we're trying to counter misinformation, we need to acknowledge that a lot of this content is very emotional. I think it's okay to say, hey, we're talking about war, we're talking about diseases. This is inherently going to be emotional, but we shouldn't be trying to manipulate the viewer's emotions. And so I think pre-bunking does a nice job of saying, hey, you should be the one in charge of your own emotions here.
So whether it's being in charge of your own emotions, John, I wonder what organisations, media organisations, what they could be doing in order to kind of help cut through.
Yeah, I think it's about empowering people to be able to identify misinformation and build their own resilience against being misled. And everyone likes being empowered, so I think that if we can give people the tools to be able to spot techniques used to mislead, that helps people be able to separate fact and fiction.
But is there a danger that then you are actually guiding and influencing, or whichever the organisation is therefore then guiding and influencing? Is there? I just wonder how you balance that out.
The way to frame, I think, pre-bunking and inoculation is it's really about critical thinking. It's about teaching people to be immune from being misled or to be influenced by propaganda. So it's actually the opposite of propaganda or influence.
And Calouste, in terms of, and I don't want to be negative about it, but limitations, I'm sure you've been looking at that as well. Pre-bunking, is it the one solve-all tool that we really need?
It's so rare that one solution you could say for any complex problem like this is that you can say this is the silver bullet. This isn't the only thing we can do, and that is something. I love the inoculation analogy because of that, right? Because that you're getting a vaccine doesn't mean that you don't need a treatment if you actually get sick, but it really decreases the possibilities that you are getting sick. I think with this misinformation treatments, it's exactly the same. If you are able to raise everyone, to lift everyone to a higher place, or most of the people, then you are creating a difference for the future. You are protecting them in a way that you won't be able to do from merely reactive stuff. Also, because we all know, and the researchers in the room know better than I do, that first impressions matter, that the way we construct the frames when we are thinking about stuff. So getting them first has a value in itself, and providing people with tools to understand the rest of reality has a value in itself.
Yeah, go on, Beth.
Can I add an example to what Calouste is saying here? So I recently completed a study with some colleagues of ours at American University in Washington, D.C., and we were trying to pre-bunk the concept of white supremacy, or this idea that whites are biologically superior. And so we showed a whole bunch of people, a pre-bunking message in a controlled environment. And what we found completely on accident was that the subset of our audience who told us that they hung out in sort of the dark far right corners of the internet, pre-bunking had no effect for them. So in other words, the pre-bunking video worked beautifully for the people who did not already have the virus or didn't already have those white supremacist preconceptions. But the people who, through a variety of questions and through their behaviors that they told us, they already sort of maybe had some of those white supremacist ideas, that it was not the right approach for them. So we might need a different treatment than pre-bunking for those audiences.
Okay, so John, to put you on the spot, what's the different treatment?
What's the what, sorry?
Different treatment.
The different treatments. So I think it's good to acknowledge that pre-bunking in and of itself is not a tool of persuasion, right? It doesn't work like that, much like a vaccine isn't the same as a cure, right? So other treatments, I think, would include something like thinking about polarization, right? Which is much more, like, people who are more polarized are generally more vulnerable to extreme ideas, let's say, right? And so if at a societal level a country is extremely polarized, or society is extremely polarized, that serves as a conduit for various sort of persuasions that we might want to seek to combat. And so it's not just a question of psychology for me, it's also a question of how at a societal level do we deal with certain phenomena that are not easily solved through any intervention, be they games or videos or whatever they might be.
If I might, this is fascinating, because also we need to think about our targets here. There is this very small subset of the population that is really radicalized in some way, like is maybe thinking that there are, this is a real example, spaceships on the dark side of the moon waiting to invade Earth. I deal with this every day. And then there is the larger set of the population that you can do treatments that are very effective, that are not, they might not even say, no, I completely trust John Cook, though they should. But they still pay attention to what he says and what other people say. So I think we need to be careful about targets, because sometimes we might be spending a lot of time and resources on a very small subset of people that are very difficult to convince otherwise. But then there is the rest of the society that we need to be focusing on.
So a polarized society, the rest of society. I guess, John, in terms of like something tangible, when with your work, especially with looking at climate change, how do you address some of the very many issues that we've heard thus far?
Yeah, I think that in the issue of climate change, that's exactly, I think, the right approach. It's thinking about the public not as one big monolith, but as different groups. And one simplistic way, but a helpful way that I look at it with climate change is you have, at least in the US, about half the population are convinced about climate change. About 30–40% are disengaged or undecided, and then around 10% are dismissive. And each of those audiences require different messages or different strategies with different goals. The inoculation analogy is really helpful because inoculation can be used to inoculate the 90% of the public who aren't dismissive or distrustful or conspiratorial about climate science, and stopping the misinformation from that 10% from spreading and influencing the rest of the public.
So I wonder when it comes to targeting specific groups then, John, and I'm just going to keep the focus on you because you've done so much work with a group that is quite polarized. Targeting, if you're targeting to such an extent, are you then potentially giving different messages? Shouldn't everybody be getting the same message? And I understand that not everybody's susceptible to the same message, but do you see where I'm going with this? You're giving different people different messages, and is that not a concern?
Well, I mean, I think it's practical. It's what you need to do to be effective, because different audiences respond to different messages, usually from different messengers. So messengers who share the values of the audience that they're trying to reach are much more effective than someone who comes in and doesn't connect with their values. So I think definitely you do need to have messages that are not only might have different content or different emphasis, but even framed differently so that it is more in line with the audience's values.
So a tailoring. Talking about audiences, perfect link now. Ronan Kennedy has got in touch, and he asks, Ronan is asking, is there not a further risk that pre-bunking runs the risk of being accused of shutting down debate or some version of thought policing by bad faith actors? So it was something similar to what we've been talking about, particularly in those who the messages most need to reach are not on platforms where they will see the pre-bunking message. I'll throw this up. Who wants to take that? Because that's quite a challenging one. John,
I'm
yes.
happy to.
Good.
I mean, you see this happening with fact-checking already, right? That the word fact-checking itself is becoming politicized. And you can do that with any word if you want to, right? So there's nothing preventing someone from saying, oh, now they're trying to pre-bunk everything. They're trying to vaccinate your brain, right? I'm just making something up.
Good. Thanks for clarifying that. That's pretty important.
That's completely made up. Don't do that. Right, but that can happen, right? But what I think the advantage of the approach is that you're not making a truth claim at all. You're saying this is what it looks like when someone is trying to take advantage of you or when someone is trying to manipulate you. Do with that information what you will, right? We're not going to tell you what to do with that at all. Just as long as you know, even people you like might be trying to pull this kind of stunt to get more clicks, let's say, or to get you to feel a certain way or whatever it might be. And so pointing that out has sort of demonstrable empirical advantages in terms of people's ability to recognize when they're being misled. And so I think it's also not just the approach itself, but also the empirical sort of the data that we get out of these studies that we run that shows that there's, generally speaking, a sort of beneficial effect for those who choose to engage, which is, of course, because it's completely voluntary, not always a given.
Well, and again, that kind of goes back to the hard-to-reach audiences that we were talking about a little bit earlier. We've got a live question from table 11. If you'd like to, who are you, and if there's a specific panelist that you'd like to aim this question to.
Hi, I'm Elena Refsko. I'm from the Guardian Foundation. I'm just going to move slightly so that maybe my face can be seen on screen. So we run education programs, media literacy education programs, which are really all underpinned by critical literacy, which is, I suppose, an educator's version of what pre-bunking is, I think. And we do this primarily through schools and teacher training, and we do quite substantial education interventions, because we know we're going to reach a lot of people that way. And we're not the only people doing that. There are a lot of media literacy organisations already doing this work, so they're already doing this out there. But I suppose my question is, how do we get this more widely adopted? So first part, how do we get more people to do this? But then also, how do you reach people who are outside of formal education? How could you replicate more substantial education interventions that's not just a one-off thing for people who are in different age groups, different settings, outside of those formal education settings?
Carlos, let's hear your answer.
Yeah, thanks for the question, because it's really a question we have posed ourselves a lot of times. Because the kids, we know they are in the schools, and we know they are over this digital bridge thing, because they are more digital savvy than any of us, right? So how do we get to those other people? Where those people are spend their time? It's a question, because we have been doing some projects with public libraries, with senior homes, but in the end, the kind of critical mass that you are looking for, I guess, it's hard to reach at one place. So I think over here we need to speak about traditional media, which is still very, very, very persuasive to an older generation that is having problems on the problems we are all having with misinformation. But in addition to that, they have a digital breach problem that they need also to address. So we are looking at many different places to address, many ways to address that, to also affect the rural-city divide in that sense. So I would say there is no easy fix for that, but it's great that we are asking ourselves those questions, because we have been focusing a lot on young people, and there are a part of the population that is more affluent, that vote much more than any other subgroup, and we are still not helping or not working with that group as much as we should.
It's no easy answer. It's frustrating, but it's good to get that honesty. Beth, go on.
To the second half of your question on reaching the audience that's outside of schools, I actually came to John and his team at Cambridge with this question 2 years ago, and I said, can we scale pre-bunking? What if we made short videos and put them on social media? And so the video that you all just saw on false dichotomies was actually one of the outcomes of that work. And I think we've got a forthcoming study that I'm going to tease exclusively to you all, where we tested short videos on social media as ads. And so I think ads are maybe one place that could scale these pre-bunking messages to a much wider audience beyond a classroom. I also think creators, you mentioned earlier in your question in the last panel, it could be a phenomenal way to be scaling some of these pre-bunking messages. So throwing those out there as ideas, we have a lot more testing and refining and research to do on exactly who the right messengers are and exactly how to convey those at scale. But I think social media can actually be a wonderful tool to disseminate these really widely.
And we've been hearing so much about, of course, what is happening with misinformation, the war in Ukraine. We've got a question from Tabia Sampati, who asks, how can you prevent the enemy side, and in this context, Tabia is talking about the Russian army, from using pre-bunking against your pre-bunking? Wow, that's John, over to you.
Yeah, it's a very complicated question.
Isn't
I mean,
it?
you can't really prevent anyone from doing anything, right? It's just, yeah, I think the interventions that you have to design simply have to be better, meaning more entertaining, explain the manipulation technique better, trying to stay a little bit ahead of the curve by trying to predict what kinds of narratives might pop up. So, for example, within the context of the war in Ukraine, I think that there's a lot of value to staying ahead of the curve like that, because that is often not really done, meaning I think that a lot of approaches are reactive, which is not a bad thing, but only reacting I don't think is necessarily the right way to go. Hence, you should also be reacting. Is that a thing?
Proactive?
No, John, we need to hear this, because we need something to take away that we can tangibly focus on. So preactive, reactive, what's the solution? What do you reckon? What should we be doing?
I was going to talk more about the problem in response to that question.
Go for it.
Because one form of inoculation, the technical term would be source-based inoculation, or just making people distrustful of a source. And that is used a lot to breed cynicism, like just the words fake news has been used to inoculate big chunks of the public against any mainstream media that might be critical of a specific politician. And that's really damaging and I think a destructive influence. So we need to be pre-bunking against those types of cynicism type campaigns.
And also that part of pre-bunking comes from debunking. because if you are actually trying to portray a source, it has to be because you have sufficient evidence that they have been pushing this information in the past, and they have been, so that's, I would say that there is a group of interventions and treatments that need to come together, because other than that, it's difficult to, to assert the quality or the trustworthiness of a source if you haven't a track record that you can defend that, which is partly what fact-checking is doing.
I'll tell you what, Beth, we need your workshop. We really do. You've got to have a look at this workshop. It's fantastic. Guys, thank you so much. A lot to consider, and we will just have a little think about that. And thank you so much to all of your questions as well. John, Carlos, John, Beth, thank you so much. Absolutely brilliant panel. Thank you. Now, we have had so much great interaction from you. I'd like to just thank you, and I'd like to say, take this opportunity to say how delighted I am that so many of you in the audience and also virtually at home in person have been so interactive. Huge thanks to our incredible panelists for their participation on really pressing issues, ones which, well, as you can see, so clearly affect each and every one of us.